The wind howled through Willow Creek like a wounded animal, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of rain. Clara Whitfield stood at the window of her family's modest cabin, watching dust devils dance across the Wyoming plains. The sky had turned that peculiar shade of purple-gray that always preceded the season's storms, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Clara, child, step away from that window and help me with this hem," her mother called from across the room. Margaret Whitfield sat hunched over a wedding dress, Clara's wedding dress, her weathered hands working steadily despite the tremor that had plagued them these past months. Clara moved to her mother's side, kneeling on the rough wooden floor. The dress was simple, made from the finest fabric they could afford, which wasn't saying much. White cotton with small pearl buttons her mother had saved from her own wedding day 23 years ago. It would do. It had to. "You're quiet today," Margaret observed, not looking up from her stitching. "Most brides-to-be would be chattering like magpies. I suppose I'm just thinking, Mama, about Thomas. He's a good man. Clara, the Caldwell family has always been respectable folk." Clara nodded, though her thoughts hadn't been on Thomas at all. She'd been thinking about the debt collectors who'd come by last week, their face hard as the red rocks that jutted from the earth beyond town. Her father's illness had taken what little savings they had, and now, with him gone, the burden fell heavy on their shoulders. "The Caldwells own half the cattle in this valley," her mother continued, as if reading her thoughts. "You'll want for nothing." "I know, Mama." Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. Clara's fingers found the small scar on her left wrist, hidden beneath the lace cuff. 3 years old now. That scar, a reminder of a night she'd never spoken of, not even to her mother. The town of Willow Creek sprawled below their hillside cabin like a child's toy set. False-fronted buildings lined the main street: Murphy's General Store, the Salvation Saloon, Sheriff Wallace's office with its barred windows. The church sat at the north end, its wooden steeple pointing accusingly at the darkening sky. "Mrs. Henderson says there's talk in town," Margaret said carefully, biting off a thread. "About that outlaw, the one they call Black Jack Morrison." Clara's heart stuttered, but she kept her voice steady. "Oh? Killed a man down in Cheyenne, they say. Shot him in cold blood over a card game. Sheriff Wallace got word he might be heading this way." Margaret's needle paused. "They say he's got eyes like the devil himself, green as poison, green as spring grass." Clara thought unbidden, then pushed the memory away. "Surely he wouldn't come here. There's nothing in Willow Creek worth an outlaw's time." "That's what I told Mrs. Henderson. Besides, with the wedding tomorrow, the whole town will be gathered. No criminal would be fool enough to show his face." Clara stood abruptly, needing air. "I'm going to check on the chickens. In this weather, they get skittish before storms. I won't be long." Outside, the wind whipped her hair around her face. The chickens were already roosting, feathers ruffled against the coming tempest. Clara leaned against the coop, closing her eyes. Jed Morrison. She'd never known his last name that night 3 years ago. He'd simply been Jed, the stranger who'd found her half-frozen in a snowdrift when her horse had thrown her. She'd been riding back from visiting the Perkins family, delivering preserves, when the blizzard had struck sudden and fierce. She could still feel the warmth of the cave where he'd carried her, still smell the smoke from the fire he'd built. He'd wrapped her in his coat, fed her whiskey from a flask to stop the shivering. His hands had been gentle as he'd tended the gash on her wrist where she'd fallen against a rock. "You're lucky I came along," he'd said, his voice rough but kind. "These storms don't show mercy." They'd talked through the night while the blizzard raged. He'd told her about places she'd only dreamed of: San Francisco, Denver, even Mexico. She'd told him about her father's illness, her mother's strength, her own dreams of something beyond Willow Creek's boundaries. When morning came and the storm had passed, he'd taken her home on his horse. She'd felt the eyes of the town on them as they rode in, but he'd tipped his hat politely to everyone they passed. At her gate, he'd helped her down, his hands lingering on her waist just a moment too long. "Take care of yourself, Clara Whitfield," he'd said, and she'd wondered how he knew her name when she'd never told him. Then he was gone, leaving only the warmth of his coat around her shoulders and a restlessness in her heart that hadn't faded in 3 years. "Clara," her mother's voice carried on the wind. "Come inside, the rain's starting." The first fat drop splattered in the dust as Clara hurried back. Inside, her mother had laid out her own wedding gifts on the bed: a silver brush, a Bible with gold-edged pages, a cameo brooch that had belonged to Clara's grandmother. "These will be yours tomorrow," Margaret said softly, "after the preacher speaks his words." Clara touched each item, trying to feel the joy a bride should feel. Thomas Caldwell was everything a woman could want: steady, kind, prosperous. He didn't drink overmuch or gamble. He'd court her properly, asking her father's permission even when the old man could barely speak. He'd waited patiently through the year of mourning. "Do you love him?" she'd asked her mother once. "Love?" Margaret had seemed surprised by the question. "Love is a luxury. Child, respect, security, kindness. These are what matter. Love, if it comes later." Now, listening to the rain beginning to drum on the roof, Clara wondered if her mother had ever stood at a window watching storms roll in, thinking of a different life, if she'd ever felt her heart race at the memory of green eyes and gentle hands. "I should go to town," Clara said suddenly, "to thank Reverend Mills for agreeing to perform the ceremony. In this weather, don't be foolish." But Clara was already reaching for her cloak. "The church is sturdy. I'll be fine." Margaret sighed but didn't argue further. She knew her daughter's stubborn streak, had seen it in the set of her jaw since she was small. The ride to town was wet and miserable, but Clara needed the fierce kiss of rain on her face, needed the sting of it to clear her head. Tomorrow she would be Mrs. Thomas Caldwell. Tomorrow her life would follow the path laid out neat and straight as the fence lines that divided the valley. The church was empty when she arrived, water dripping from her cloak onto the plain wooden floors. She sat in the back pew, staring at the simple altar where tomorrow the preacher would bless her wedding. "It's a good match." The voice made her jump. Reverend Mills emerged from the vestry, his kind face creased with concern. "But you look troubled, child. Just nervous, I suppose." He sat beside her, his presence comforting as her father's had once been. "Your mother tells me you've been caring for the family since your father passed. That's a heavy burden for young shoulders. Thomas will help. He's promised to pay off our debts." "Ah." The Reverend was quiet for a moment. "And is that why you're marrying him?" Clara looked up sharply, but his eyes held no judgment. "He's a good man. Indeed he is, but that wasn't what I asked." The rain hammered harder on the roof, somewhere in the distance. Thunder crashed like breaking stones. "I want my mother to be secure," Clara said finally. "I want to honor my father's memory. I want—" She trailed off. "And what do you want for yourself?" The question hung in the air between them. Clara thought of her mother's hands, shaking as they sewed, of Thomas's patient smile, of debts and duties and the weight of being a good woman in a hard world. "I want to do what's right," she whispered. Reverend Mills patted her hand. "Then you will. God give you strength for it." As Clara rode home through the storm, she thought she saw a rider on the ridge above town, silhouetted against the lightning-split sky. But when she looked again, there was only darkness and rain. That night, as her mother slept, Clara stood once more at the window. The storm raged on, fierce and wild and free. Somewhere out there, beyond the boundaries of Willow Creek, the world stretched vast and unknown. Somewhere out there, a man with green eyes might be riding through the rain, running from the law or toward some new horizon. Tomorrow the preacher would bless her wedding. Tomorrow she would promise to love, honor, and obey Thomas Caldwell until death parted them. But tonight, with a storm shaking the walls and her heart beating wild as thunder, Clara Whitfield allowed herself one last moment to remember what it felt like to want something more. The morning of Clara's wedding dawned with sheets of rain hammering against the earth, turning the streets of Willow Creek into rivers of red mud. The storm that had threatened the night before had arrived in full force, as if the heavens themselves were in turmoil. Clara stood before the cracked mirror in her room, her mother's hands working to pin up her hair. Each flash of lightning illuminated her pale face in the glass, making her look like a ghost bride. "Hold still, child," Margaret murmured around the pins in her mouth. "You're trembling like a leaf." "It's cold," Clara lied. The truth was that her nerves were strung tight as fence wire. Through the window, she could see the water rushing down the hillside, carving new channels in the earth. "At least the church has a good roof," Margaret said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "Though Lord knows how folks will get there in this weather. The creek will be running high." A knock at the door made them both jump. Margaret went to answer it, returning with Thomas Caldwell. He stood dripping in the doorway, his good Sunday clothes already splattered with mud. "Miss Clara," he said, removing his hat. Water ran from its brim onto the floor. "I came to see if you and your mother needed assistance getting to church. My wagon's sturdy, and I've got canvas to keep you dry." He was a good man, Clara reminded herself, solid as the mountains that ringed the valley. His face was honest, weathered by 35 years of sun and wind. When he smiled at her, she saw kindness there, and something else, a quiet devotion that made her feel both grateful and guilty. "That's very thoughtful, Thomas," Margaret said warmly. "We'll be ready shortly." Thomas's eyes never left Clara. "You look beautiful," he said simply, "like an angel." Clara managed a smile. "Angels don't have mud on their hem. Mine does," he replied, and his unexpected humor surprised a genuine laugh from her. The ride to church was treacherous. The horses struggled through the mud, and more than once Thomas had to get down to guide them around washouts. The rain drove sideways under the canvas, soaking them despite his efforts. Clara sat between her mother and her future husband, very aware of Thomas's solid warmth beside her. The church looked like a ship in a storm when they arrived, its windows glowing with lamplight against the dark morning. Other wagons were already gathered, the horses standing miserable in the rain. Men helped women down, everyone rushing for the sanctuary of the church doors. Inside, the small building was packed. It seemed the entire town had braved the storm to witness the wedding of Thomas Caldwell and Clara Whitfield. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool and kerosene from the lamps. Reverend Mills stood at the altar, his prayer book ready. Clara took her place at the back of the church while Thomas went to wait at the altar. She had no father to give her away, so she would walk alone. The organist, Mrs. Peterson, began to play, the notes barely audible over the sound of rain on the roof. As Clara began her walk down the aisle, lightning flashed through the windows, throwing strange shadows across the congregation. She kept her eyes forward, aware of every face turned toward her. Mrs. Henderson, with her knowing smile, Sheriff Wallace and his wife, the Perkins family, all the good people of Willow Creek, gathered to witness her transformation from the poor Whitfield girl to Mrs. Thomas Caldwell. Halfway down the aisle, another flash of lightning illuminated the windows, and Clara's steps faltered. There, through the rain-streaked glass, she saw a figure on horseback, a man in a black duster, his hat pulled low. Sitting still as stone despite the storm raging around him, her heart stopped. Then thunder crashed, and when she looked again, the figure was gone. Perhaps it had never been there at all. Perhaps it was only her imagination, conjured by nerves and memories. Thomas was watching her with concern. She forced her feet forward, one step, then another, until she stood beside him at the altar. Reverend Mills opened his prayer book, raising his voice above the storm. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God and in the presence of this company, to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The words washed over Clara like the rain outside. She was aware of Thomas taking her hand, of his calloused fingers warm against hers. She was aware of her mother in the front pew, tears on her cheeks. She was aware of the storm shaking the walls, making the lamps flicker. Marriage is an honorable estate, the Reverend continued, instituted by God, and not to be entered into lightly or unadvisedly, but reverently, soberly, and in the fear of God. Lightning flashed again. Thunder followed immediately, so loud that several women gasped. The church seemed to tremble on its foundations. If any man can show just cause why these two may not be lawfully joined together, let him speak now, or else forever hold his peace. The silence that followed was filled with the voice of the storm. Clara found herself holding her breath, waiting for what? For the church doors to burst open, for a voice to cry out in protest. But there was only rain and wind and the breathing of the congregation. Thomas Caldwell, Reverend Mills said, "Wilt thou have this woman to be thy wedded wife, to live together after God's ordinance in the holy estate of matrimony? Wilt thou love her, comfort her, honor and keep her, in sickness and in health, and forsaking all others? Keep thee only unto her, so long as ye both shall live." "I will," Thomas said, his voice strong and certain. "Clara Whitfield, wilt thou have this man to be thy wedded husband, to live together after God's ordinance in the holy estate of matrimony? Wilt thou love, honor, and obey him, in sickness and in health, and forsaking all others, keep thee only unto him, so long as ye both shall live?" The words stuck in Clara's throat. Through the window, she could swear she saw the rider again, closer now, just beyond the churchyard fence. Lightning illuminated him for an instant. The black duster, the hat shadowing his face, the patient stillness of his posture. "Clara," Reverend Mills prompted gently. Clara's voice came out as a whisper. She cleared her throat, aware of the congregation shifting restlessly. "I will." Thomas squeezed her hand, and she realized she was gripping his fingers too tightly. She tried to focus on his face, on the quiet joy she saw there, but her gaze kept drifting to the windows. The Reverend continued with the ceremony, his words rising and falling like the wind. The preacher blessed her wedding. He intoned, making the sign of the cross over their joined hands. "What God hath joined together, let no man put asunder." Another crash of thunder, the loudest yet. The church door rattled in its frame. Clara turned her head involuntarily, and there he was, not outside anymore, but standing in the doorway of the church. The rider in black, water streaming from his duster, his hat still shadowing his face. Nobody else seemed to notice him. The congregation was focused on the altar, on the blessing being pronounced. Only Clara saw him raise his head, saw the flash of green eyes beneath the brim of his hat. Jed. The recognition hit her like a physical blow. 3 years had changed him. His face was leaner, harder, with a scar along his jaw that hadn't been there before. But those eyes were the same, green as spring grass, looking at her with an intensity that made her knees weak. "You may kiss your bride," Reverend Mills was saying. Thomas turned to her, his face gentle and expectant. Clara forced herself to meet his kiss, to play the part of the happy bride, but her whole body was aware of the man in the doorway. When Thomas released her and they turned to face the congregation as husband and wife, Jed was gone. Had he ever been there at all? Had anyone else seen him? Clara searched the faces of the crowd as they made their way down the aisle, but saw only smiles and congratulations. Her mother was weeping with joy. Sheriff Wallace was already heading for the door, probably eager to get home out of the storm. The wedding party made their way to the church hall for the modest reception Margaret had managed to arrange. There was cake and coffee, fiddle music when the thunder allowed. Clara moved through it all in a daze, accepting congratulations, dancing with her new husband, playing the role expected of her. But her eyes kept going to the windows, to the door, to every shadow that might hide a man in a black duster. "You're pale," Thomas said during a break in the dancing. "Are you feeling well?" "Just tired," Clara assured him. "And the storm?" He nodded, understanding. "It's been a trying day. We'll leave soon. The old McCready place is the closest shelter. We can stay there tonight and continue to the ranch tomorrow when the roads are clear." The old McCready place, an abandoned homestead on the edge of town. But it had walls and a roof. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. As the afternoon wore on and the storm showed no signs of abating, guests began to leave. Clara stood with Thomas at the church door, bidding farewell to their neighbors. Sheriff Wallace paused beside them, his face grave. "Got word from Cheyenne," he said to Thomas, low enough that Clara had to strain to hear. "That outlaw, Black Jack Morrison, he killed a deputy 2 days ago. They say he's heading north. Keep your guns loaded and your wife close." "I will," Thomas promised, his arm tightening around Clara's waist. The sheriff tipped his hat to Clara. "Congratulations, Mrs. Caldwell. You've got a good man here. Mrs. Caldwell." The name felt foreign on her shoulders, like a dress that didn't quite fit. Clara smiled and nodded, playing her part, while inside her heart raced with knowledge she couldn't share. Jed Morrison was here. He'd stood in the church and watched her marry another man. And somewhere in this storm-torn day, she knew with a certainty that made her tremble. She would see him again. The preacher had blessed her wedding, pronounced the words that bound her to Thomas Caldwell for life, but the storm outside seemed to mock the very idea of earthly bonds. And Clara couldn't shake the feeling that her story, her real story, was only just beginning. The old McCready place squatted on the edge of town like a forgotten memory, its wooden walls gray with age and neglect. Rain poured off the sagging roof in waterfalls, and the windows were dark as empty eye sockets. Thomas pulled the wagon as close to the front door as he could manage, then helped Clara down, shielding her with his coat. "It's not much," he said apologetically as they stumbled through the door. "But it's dry, and there's a fireplace. I'll have you at the ranch tomorrow, I promise. Our real home." Our home. The words should have warmed her, but Clara felt only a strange numbness as she looked around the abandoned cabin. Dust cloths covered what little furniture remained, and cobwebs hung in the corners like tattered lace. "I'll get a fire started," Thomas said, already moving toward the hearth. "Then I need to see to the horses. This storm's not letting up." Clara watched him work, efficient and careful, coaxing flame from the dry wood someone had left stacked by the fireplace. The light pushed back the shadows, revealing a simple main room with a kitchen area and a door leading to what must be a bedroom. "There," Thomas said with satisfaction as the fire caught. "That should warm things up. I won't be long." He kissed her forehead, a gentle, husbandly gesture, and went back out into the storm. Clara stood alone in the flickering light, still wearing her wedding dress, now damp and mud-stained at the hem. She moved closer to the fire, holding her hands out to the warmth, trying to stop their trembling. The door crashed open. Clara spun around, her heart hammering. For a wild moment, she expected Thomas, but the figure in the doorway was taller, leaner, moving with a predator's grace despite the water streaming from his black duster. "Hello, Clara." Jed Morrison stepped into the light, pushing the door shut behind him. He removed his hat, shaking the water from it, and she could see his face clearly for the first time. The 3 years had carved new lines around his eyes, and that scar on his jaw was white against his sun-darkened skin. But his eyes, those green eyes that had haunted her dreams, were exactly as she remembered. "You can't be here," she whispered. "Yet here I am." He stayed by the door, making no move to come closer. "Congratulations on your wedding. Thomas Caldwell's a fortunate man." "Why did you come back?" A smile touched his lips, bitter as winter wind. "Would you believe me if I said I was just passing through?" "No." "Smart girl. You always were too smart for a place like this." He moved then, just a step, and Clara found herself backing away instinctively. "I heard about your father. I'm sorry." "How did you—" She stopped herself. Of course he'd kept track of her, just as she'd listened for any whisper of news about the outlaw, Black Jack Morrison. "I know a lot of things," Jed said. "I know your family owes $300 to the bank. I know Thomas Caldwell promised to pay it. I know you've been working yourself to the bone trying to keep your mother fed and housed. His voice dropped. And I know you don't love him. You don't know anything about what I feel, don't I? He took another step closer, and this time Clara held her ground. I was there. Clara, I watched you walk down that aisle like you were going to your own funeral. I saw your face when the preacher asked for your vows. I said yes. I married him. Because you had to. Because it was the smart thing, the safe thing. Because that's what Clara Whitfield does, the right thing. Always the right thing. His voice turned rough. Even if it kills something inside her. Stop! Clara's voice shook. You have no right. I have every right. Suddenly, he was directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell rain and leather and something wild underneath. 3 years. Clara, 3 years I've stayed away, telling myself you were better off, that I had nothing to offer but a life on the run. Then I heard you were marrying him. And I... He stopped, jaw clenching. You what? The words came out as barely a whisper. I couldn't let you do it without seeing you one more time, without making sure it was what you wanted. Clara laughed, a sound with no humor in it. What I want, when has that ever mattered? My father is dead, my mother is ill, we're about to lose everything. What I want is a luxury I can't afford. And if you could afford it? His hand came up, fingertips barely grazing her cheek. What would Clara Whitfield want then? She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch for just a moment before jerking away. Don't! Please don't! He doesn't know you. Jed's voice was urgent now. He sees a pretty girl who needs saving, a wife to bear his children and keep his house. He doesn't know about the fire in you, the way you look at thunderstorms like they're calling your name. He doesn't know. He's a good man. Clara interrupted. He'll take care of me, of my mother. That's enough. Is it? The question hung between them like a challenge. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley, and the fire popped in the hearth. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warmth. They say you killed a deputy in Cheyenne, she said, changing the subject. Jed's face hardened. They say a lot of things. Did you? Does it matter? I'm already wanted for murder. One more death on Blackjack Morrison's head won't change anything. It matters to me. He studied her for a long moment. The deputy drew first. He was aiming for my back. I was faster. He shrugged, a gesture that didn't quite hide the weariness in it. That's the truth, but truth doesn't count for much when you're already branded an outlaw. The man they say you killed 3 years ago was self-defense too, bar fight that went bad, but he was the mayor's nephew, and I was just a drifter. Guess which story the jury believed? Clara wanted to touch him, to smooth away the bitterness in his face, but she kept her hands locked around herself. So you ran. I ran. He smiled without humor. Been running ever since. Mexico, California, Colorado, always moving, always looking over my shoulder. It's no life for anyone. Especially not. He trailed off. Especially not what? Especially not for someone I care about. The words hung in the air between them. Clara felt tears burning her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. Then why are you here? Why now? Because I'm a fool. His voice was rough. Because I thought I could stay away. But when I heard about the wedding, I had to see for myself. I had to know if you remembered that night in the cave the way I do. Jed, do you remember what we talked about? He moved closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. You told me about wanting to see the ocean, about reading every book in your father's collection twice, about feeling trapped in Willow Creek like a bird in too small a cage. Stop. Clara's voice broke. You told me you sometimes climbed to the top of Cathedral Rock just to see how far the horizon stretched, that you wondered what was beyond it. That was a girl's foolish dreams. Was it? His hands came up to frame her face, gentle as she remembered. Or was that the real Clara, the one you hide from everyone else? She was crying now, unable to stop the tears. It doesn't matter. I'm married. I made vows before God and the whole town. I know. His thumbs wiped away her tears. "I'm not asking you to break them. I needed to see you, to hear you say you're happy. Can you say that, Clara? Can you look me in the eye and tell me you're happy?" She opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. How could she lie to him when he was looking at her like that, like she was everything he'd ever wanted and couldn't have? The sound of horses splashing through mud made them both freeze. Jed stepped back quickly, his hand going to the gun at his hip. "It's Thomas," Clara said unnecessarily. "He'll be checking the horses. I should go." "Yes," but neither of them moved. They stood there, the fire crackling between them, the storm raging outside, and Clara felt like she was balanced on the edge of a cliff. One step in either direction would send her falling. "Clara?" Thomas's voice called from outside. "I'm checking the barn. Be inside in a moment." "Go!" Clara whispered urgently. "Please, before he—" "I'm staying at the old mine shaft," Jed said quickly. "The abandoned one past Cathedral Rock. If you need me, if you need anything, I won't. But if you do—" His eyes bored into hers. "Promise me, Clara, if you're ever in trouble, if he ever—" "He won't. Thomas is a good man. Promise me anyway." "I promise," she said, just to make him leave. He moved toward the door, then paused. "I loved you from the moment I pulled you out of that snowbank," he said quietly. "I'll love you until they put me in the ground. That's my curse to carry." He put on his hat, touching the brim in a gesture of farewell. "Be happy, Mrs. Caldwell. Be as happy as you can be." Then he was gone, slipping out into the storm like a shadow. Clara sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to hold her. She scrubbed at her face, trying to erase any sign of tears, trying to compose herself before Thomas returned. The door opened a few minutes later, and her husband entered, shaking water from his coat. "Horses are settled," he said cheerfully. "This storm's a devil, but at least we're safe and—" "Clara, are you all right?" She looked up at him, this good man she'd married, and forced a smile. "Just tired," she said. "It's been a long day." "Of course it has." He came to her, kneeling beside her chair. "You're cold. Come, let's get you into some dry clothes." She let him fuss over her, let him lead her to the bedroom where someone had left old quilts. She changed out of her wedding dress while he built up the fire in the bedroom's small hearth. Everything felt distant, unreal, as if she were watching someone else's life from very far away. That night, as Thomas slept peacefully beside her, Clara lay awake listening to the storm, somewhere out there. Jed was riding through the rain, carrying his love like a wound that wouldn't heal. And here she was, in a borrowed bed with a husband she didn't love, playing at being the woman everyone expected her to be. The preacher had blessed her wedding. She'd made sacred vows. She was Mrs. Thomas Caldwell now, and that would be her truth until death. But in the darkness, with thunder shaking the walls and her heart wild as the wind outside, Clara pressed her face into the pillow and let herself imagine, just for a moment, what it would be like to be as free as the storm itself. The storm raged through the night like a living thing, tearing at the walls of the old McCready place with invisible claws. Thunder rolled endlessly across the valley, each crash followed by lightning that turned the world white for an instant before plunging it back into darkness. Clara sat by the dying fire in the main room, a quilt wrapped around her shoulders. She'd given up on sleep hours ago, leaving Thomas in the bedroom where he slumbered peacefully, unaware of her turmoil. The good man, the kind husband, sleeping the sleep of the righteous while his wife's heart tore itself apart. She fed another piece of wood to the fire, watching the flames leap up hungrily. The light danced across the walls, creating shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. In those shadows, she could almost see Jed's face, the pain in his green eyes when he'd said he loved her. The wind howled through the gaps in the walls, and with it came memories, not just of 3 years ago, but of all the years before that, all the small deaths of dreams and desires that had led her to this moment. When had she stopped believing in the possibility of more? When had she accepted that this was all life would offer? A particularly violent gust of wind made the door rattle in its frame. Clara pulled the quilt tighter, but it wasn't the cold that made her shiver. It was the knowledge that out there in the storm, Jed was probably sheltering in that abandoned mine shaft, alone with his outlaw's burden. She stood abruptly, pacing to the window. The glass was black with rain, reflecting only her own pale face back at her. Mrs. Thomas Caldwell, she told herself firmly. You are Mrs. Thomas Caldwell, and you have duties, responsibilities. You made a choice. But had she really? Or had the choice been made for her by circumstances, by poverty, by the weight of being a woman in a world that offered so few options? Can't sleep. Clara whirled around. Thomas stood in the bedroom doorway, his hair tousled from sleep, concern creasing his honest face. The storm, she said, gesturing vaguely at the window. It's so loud. He came to her, wrapping his arms around her from behind. She could feel his solid warmth, smell the familiar scent of soap and hay that always clung to him. You're trembling, he said softly. Come back to bed. You'll catch your death out here. In a moment. I need a few more minutes. He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. In the firelight, she could see the worry in his brown eyes, the genuine care. He was a good man. She'd married a good man. Clara, what's wrong? And don't say it's just the storm. I may not be the smartest man in Wyoming, but I know my wife. My wife. The words sat heavy between them. It's nothing, she began, but he shook his head. Is it because of what Sheriff Wallace said about that outlaw? His jaw tightened. I won't let anything happen to you. Clara, any man who thinks he can— No, she said quickly. Too quickly. It's not that. Thomas studied her face for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he sighed and stepped back. I know this isn't what you dreamed of, he said quietly. Marrying a rancher, living out your days in Willow Creek. You're young, beautiful, smart. You could have had more. Thomas, let me finish. He moved to the fire, staring into the flames. I've loved you for 2 years. Clara, watched you care for your father. Shoulder burdens that would have broken most women. I told myself I could make you happy, give you security, a good life. He paused. But security isn't happiness, is it? Clara felt tears prick her eyes. You're a good husband, but not the one you would have chosen, given a free choice. The truth of it hung between them, unspoken but acknowledged. Clara moved to his side, touching his arm. You saved us, she said softly. My mother and me. That matters. Does it? He looked at her then, and she saw something in his face she hadn't expected. Understanding and a deep sadness. I wonder sometimes if I've caged a wild bird, thinking I was giving it a home. Before Clara could respond, a sound cut through the storm. Horses, multiple horses, riding hard despite the weather. Thomas's head came up sharply, his body tensing. Who would be out in this? Clara whispered. Stay here. Thomas moved quickly to where his rifle leaned against the wall. Get back from the windows. But Clara was already peering through the rain-streaked glass. Lightning illuminated the riders. 5 men, maybe 6, their faces hidden by the storm. They reined up outside, and she heard rough voices shouting over the wind. Someone's in there! Saw the smoke! Check it out! He might be hiding here! Thomas pushed Clara behind him as the door burst open. Men crowded in, water streaming from their coats, guns drawn. Clara recognized one of them, Hank Brewster, a bounty hunter who sometimes passed through Willow Creek. Well, well, Brewster said, lowering his weapon when he saw them. Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell, heard you got married today. Hell of a night for it. What's the meaning of this? Thomas demanded, not lowering his rifle. Looking for Blackjack Morrison, Brewster said, his eyes scanning the room. Got word he was seen in these parts. There's a $1,000 bounty on his head now. The railroad wants him bad after what happened in Cheyenne. We haven't seen anyone, Thomas said firmly. Now get out of my house. Your house? Brewster laughed unpleasantly. This is the old McCready place. Public property. More or less. His gaze landed on Clara, and something in it made her skin crawl. Though I can see why you'd want someplace private with your new bride. She's a pretty little thing. Thomas stepped forward, rifle raising. I said get out. Easy there, rancher. But Brewster backed toward the door. We're going. But if you see Morrison, you'd best remember, harboring a fugitive is a hanging offense, even for respectable folks. His eyes lingered on Clara again. Especially for respectable folks with something to lose. They filed out. But Clara heard them talking outside. Heard one suggest checking the barn. She pressed her face against Thomas's back, trying to stop trembling. If they searched too thoroughly, if they decided to check the old mine shaft. Bastards, Thomas muttered when they'd ridden off. Using the storm as an excuse to terrorize people. Clara said nothing, but her mind was racing. $1,000. That was more than 3 times what her family owed. Enough to tempt desperate men to do desperate things. Clara, Thomas turned to her, his face grave. I need to ask you something, and I need the truth. Her heart stopped. What? That outlaw, Morrison. Have you ever seen him? The lie should have come easily. Instead, Clara found herself frozen, staring into her husband's honest face. Clara? Once, she whispered. 3 years ago, he saved my life in a blizzard. Thomas's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. I see. And has he tried to contact you since? This time the lie came. No, never. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. All right. But if he does, if he comes anywhere near you, you tell me immediately. Promise me. I promise. He set the rifle down and drew her into his arms. She let him hold her, let him murmur reassurances. But her mind was elsewhere, out in the storm where Jed might be running. Hunted like an animal. The thought of those rough men catching him, of Brewster collecting his bounty. We should leave at first light. Thomas was saying, get to the ranch where it's safe. I'll send word to Sheriff Wallace about Brewster and his men. Clara nodded against his chest, but she was thinking of Jed's words. I'm staying at the old mine shaft. If Brewster decided to search the abandoned mines, I need some air, she said suddenly, pulling away. In this storm, Clara, just for a moment, please, I feel faint. Thomas's concern deepened. Of course, but stay on the porch. She grabbed her cloak and slipped outside. The rain had lessened to a steady downpour, and the lightning had moved off to the east. She stood under the meager shelter of the porch roof, trying to see through the darkness. Should she try to warn him? Could she even find the mine in this weather? A hand clamped over her mouth from behind. Clara's scream was muffled as she was pulled back against a hard chest. Then a familiar voice whispered in her ear, It's me. Don't make a sound. Jed released her, and she spun to face him. He was soaked through, his black duster plastered to his body, water running from the brim of his hat. What are you doing here? She hissed. Those men, I saw them. That's why I came. His eyes swept over her, checking for harm. Did they hurt you? No, but they're looking for you. There's $1,000 bounty. I know. He glanced at the door. Where's your husband? Inside. Jed, you have to leave. If they find you, I'm going. He caught her hands in his. But first I needed to warn you. Brewster and his kind don't give up easy. They might come back, might try to use you to flush me out. I won't let them. Listen to me. His grip tightened. I'm leaving Wyoming tonight, heading for Montana, maybe Canada. I won't give them an excuse to hurt you. Clara felt something tear inside her chest. You're leaving. It's what's best, for both of us. His thumb brushed over her wedding ring, and his jaw clenched. Your husband, does he treat you well? Yes. Good. That's good. He released her hands, stepping back. Be happy. Clara, find whatever happiness you can. Wait. The word escaped before she could stop it. "The mine? Is it safe? Those men might search." A sad smile touched his lips. "Worried about me, Mrs. Caldwell?" "Always," she admitted, and saw him flinch as if she'd struck him. "The mine's got another exit," he said. "I'll be gone before they think to look there." He touched his hat brim. That same gesture of farewell he'd made hours ago. "Take care of yourself, Clara." "Jed," but he was already disappearing into the storm, swallowed by darkness and rain. Clara stood there, water dripping from her cloak, her hands still warm from his touch. "Clara?" Thomas's voice from inside. "Are you all right?" "Coming," she called back, her voice steady despite the tears mixing with rain on her face. She went back inside to her husband, to the life she'd chosen, to the safety and security of being Mrs. Thomas Caldwell. The storm continued to rage outside, but within the walls of the old McCready place, there was warmth and light and a good man's protection. It should have been enough. It had to be enough. But as Clara let Thomas lead her back to bed, as she lay beside him listening to the gradual quieting of the storm, she knew that some part of her would always be out there in the wild darkness, riding toward a horizon she'd never see. The night crawled toward dawn, and with it would come a new day, a new life, the life of a rancher's wife, respectable and safe. The outlaw would be gone, a memory to lock away with all the other impossible dreams. But memories, Clara was learning, could be as dangerous as any storm. Dawn never came. The storm, instead of passing, seemed to gather new strength as if fed by the turmoil in Clara's heart. She dozed fitfully, waking to find Thomas already up and dressed, loading his rifle. "What is it?" she asked, sitting up quickly. "Thought I heard horses again." His face was grim. "Stay inside, no matter what happens." He went out into the gray morning, and Clara dressed hurriedly, her fingers clumsy on the buttons. Through the window, she could see Thomas checking the barn, his movements careful and alert. The rain had become a deluge, turning the world into a blur of water and mud. When he came back, his expression was troubled. "Someone's been here, fresh tracks leading away from the barn, maybe an hour old." Clara's heart raced. Had Jed come back, or was it Brewster's men, circling like wolves? "We're leaving," Thomas decided. "Storm or no storm, I don't like this." They packed quickly, Clara helping Thomas hitch the horses despite his protests. The animals were skittish, rolling their eyes at the thunder that still growled overhead. As Thomas secured their belongings in the wagon, Clara stood in the doorway of the cabin, something making her reluctant to leave. "Clara, come on," Thomas called over the wind. She turned to go, then froze. There, carved fresh into the doorframe, were 3 words: "Remember your promise." Her hand flew to her mouth. Jed had been here, had stood where she was standing, had left this message knowing she would see it. "Clara!" She ran to the wagon, letting Thomas help her up. As they pulled away from the McCready place, she looked back once, but the cabin was already disappearing into the rain. The journey that should have taken 2 hours stretched into an eternity. The road had become a river, and twice Thomas had to get down to guide the horses around washouts. Clara huddled under the canvas, but the rain found its way through every gap, soaking them both to the skin. They were perhaps a mile from safety when it happened. Lightning struck a dead pine just ahead, the crack of it so loud Clara screamed. The tree fell across the road in a shower of sparks and smoke, and the horses reared in terror. "Whoa, easy." Thomas fought to control them, but the wagon slewed sideways, tilting dangerously. That's when Clara saw him. Jed, spurring his black horse down the hillside, riding hard through the impossible storm. He reached them just as the wagon began to tip, grabbing the near horse's bridle and using his mount's weight to steady them. "Get her out," he shouted to Thomas over the storm. Thomas didn't argue. He lifted Clara down from the wagon, and together the 2 men fought to calm the panicked horses. It was surreal, watching her husband and her, what was Jed to her, watching them work together against the storm's fury. When the horses were finally calm, the 3 of them stood there in the pouring rain, an awkward triangle of unspoken truths. "Thank you," Thomas said stiffly. Jed nodded, water streaming from his hat. His eyes found Clara's, held them for a moment that seemed to stretch forever. Then came the gunshot. Jed jerked, his hand going to his shoulder where red was already blooming through his coat. Clara screamed as he swayed in the saddle. "There he is!" Brewster's voice carried over the storm. The bounty hunters appeared through the rain, guns drawn. "Blackjack Morrison, you're under arrest or dead. Your choice." "Get behind the wagon." Thomas shoved Clara toward cover, then turned to face the approaching men. His rifle raised. "That's far enough, Brewster." "Step aside. Caldwell, this ain't your fight. You shot a man without warning. That makes it my fight." Clara crouched behind the wagon wheel, her heart pounding. She could see Jed still mounted, swaying but somehow keeping his seat. Blood ran down his arm, mixing with the rain. "He's an outlaw," Brewster snarled. $1,000, dead or alive, I aim to collect. "Then you'll have to go through me," Thomas said quietly. Clara stared at her husband in shock. He stood there in the rain, solid as a mountain, defending the man who... He had to know, on some level. Thomas had to know what Jed meant to her. "You're protecting a killer. Caldwell." "I'm protecting a man who just saved my wife's life, who saved her once before. From what I hear, that counts for something in my book." The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. 6 men with guns, all pointed at each other, while the storm raged around them like a backdrop to madness. Then Jed spoke, his voice strained with pain. "Lower your guns, all of you." He looked at Thomas. "I won't have blood spilled on my account, especially not yours." "Jed, no," Clara found herself saying, starting to rise. "Stay down," Thomas and Jed said in unison. And despite everything, the moment might have been funny if it weren't so desperate. Jed straightened in his saddle with visible effort. "You want me, Brewster? Fine, but you let them go. They've got nothing to do with this. Except harboring a fugitive." Brewster sneered. "They didn't harbor anyone. I forced my way in, threatened them. That's what you'll say. If you've got any decency in you." "Decency," Brewster laughed. "That's rich, coming from you." Lightning flashed, illuminating the tableau, Jed bleeding on his black horse, Thomas standing protective in front of the wagon, Brewster and his men hungry as wolves, and Clara crouched in the mud, her wedding dress ruined beyond repair. That's when she remembered the Derringer. Thomas had given it to her months ago, a tiny gun that fit in a lady's palm, just in case. He'd said. She'd put it in her coat pocket and forgotten about it until now. Her hand closed around it as she made a decision that would haunt her forever. "Wait!" She stood up, ignoring the shouts from both Thomas and Jed. "I'll tell you where the money is." Everyone froze. Brewster's eyes lit with greed. "What money?" "The railroad money, from the robbery last spring. He told me where he hid it." The lie came smoothly, desperately. $20,000, but only if you let him live." "Clara, what are you doing?" Thomas's voice was strangled. She kept her eyes on Brewster. "You can have the money or the bounty, but not both. He dies. The secret dies with him." Brewster considered this, greed warring with bloodlust on his face. "Where is it?" "The old Sampson mine, 3rd shaft from the entrance, behind the cave-in." She was making it up as she went, praying they were stupid enough to believe her. "But you have to let all 3 of us go. That's the deal." "No deal," Brewster decided. "We take Morrison and make him tell us." The Derringer was in her hand before she realized she'd drawn it. The tiny gun barked once, and Brewster's hat flew off his head. Everyone ducked instinctively. "The next one goes lower," Clara said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Let us go, or I'll tell Sheriff Wallace how you shot an unarmed man. How you threatened respectable citizens. The railroad might want Morrison, but they won't want the scandal." For a long moment, nobody moved. The rain poured down. Thunder rolled across the valley, and Clara kept the little gun trained on Brewster's chest. Finally. Brewster spat in the mud, "This ain't over," he said. "We'll be checking that mine, and if the money ain't there, it's there." Clara lied. "Mount up," Brewster barked at his men. "We've got digging to do." They rode off, but Clara knew they'd be back when they found nothing. They had hours at most. Thomas lowered his rifle slowly, staring at his wife as if he'd never seen her before. "Clara!" But she was already running to Jed, who had finally slumped forward over his horse's neck. "Help me get him down," she said to Thomas. "Please." For a moment, she thought Thomas would refuse. Then he sighed and moved to help. Together they eased Jed from the saddle. He was conscious, but barely, his face gray beneath his tan. "Fool woman," he mumbled. "Should have let them take me." "Shut up," Clara said, tearing at his coat to see the wound. The bullet had gone through the muscle of his shoulder, missing anything vital. But he was losing blood fast. "We need to get him somewhere safe," she said to Thomas. "The ranch." "No." Thomas's voice was flat. "Not the ranch." Clara looked up at him, saw the pain in his eyes, the betrayal, but also, underneath it, that same steady strength that made him who he was. "The line shack," he said finally. "Up on the north pasture. It's closer, and no one will think to look there." He met her eyes. "After that, we need to talk. All of us." They loaded Jed into the wagon, Clara cradling his head in her lap. As Thomas drove through the storm towards shelter, she pressed her hand against Jed's wound, trying to stem the bleeding. His eyes flickered open, focused on her face. "You should have let them take me," he whispered. "Never," she whispered back, and felt Thomas's shoulders stiffen at the word. The storm began to break as they reached the line shack, rays of sunlight piercing the clouds like spears. But Clara knew the real storm was just beginning. The lies she'd told, the choices she'd made, the love she couldn't deny, all of it would have to be faced now. She'd pulled a gun on dangerous men, lied about stolen money, chosen to save an outlaw's life. The preacher might have blessed her wedding. But in this moment, with Jed's blood on her hands and her husband's trust shattered, Clara finally understood what it meant to claim her own passion. Consequences be damned. The storm outside was passing, but the tempest in her heart raged on. The line shack was barely more than 4 walls and a roof, but it was dry and hidden in a grove of cottonwoods. Thomas carried Jed inside with surprising gentleness, laying him on the narrow cot that served as a bed. Clara immediately set to work, tearing strips from her petticoat for bandages while Thomas built a fire in the small stove. "There's whiskey in the cabinet," Thomas said without looking at her. "And some medical supplies. I keep them here for emergencies." Clara found what she needed and returned to Jed's side. He was conscious now, his green eyes tracking her movements as she cleaned the wound. When she poured whiskey over it, he hissed through clenched teeth but didn't cry out. "You should have stayed away," she said softly, working to stop the bleeding. "Couldn't." His voice was rough with pain. "Saw them heading for the cabin. Thought they might." He trailed off, his eyes flicking to Thomas, who stood by the window keeping watch. "You came back to protect us." Clara said it wasn't a question. "To protect you," Jed corrected, then winced as she tightened the bandage. The silence that followed was heavy with everything unsaid. Clara could feel Thomas's presence behind her, could sense the struggle in him between his nature and his pain. When she finished with the bandaging, she stood slowly, wiping her bloody hands on what remained of her wedding dress. "Thomas," she began, turning to face him. He held up a hand. "Not yet. Let me think." He moved to the stove, feeding it more wood with mechanical precision. "Brewster and his men will figure out you lied about the money soon enough. They'll come looking." "I know. I'm sorry. You just wanted to save him." Thomas's voice was carefully neutral. "I understand that. What I don't understand is why." Clara felt Jed trying to sit up behind her. "Caldwell, this isn't her fault. I'm not talking to you." Thomas didn't turn around. "Clara, I'm asking you a question." "Why?" The truth sat heavy on her tongue, but she couldn't form the words. How could she explain what she didn't fully understand herself? Thomas finally turned, and the raw pain in his eyes made her step back. 3 years ago, he said slowly, you changed. I noticed it. Everyone noticed it. You were always spirited, but afterward, it was like you were looking for something, waiting for something. I told myself it was your father's illness, the burden you carried. But it wasn't that, was it? Thomas, when you walked down that aisle yesterday, you looked like you were going to your execution. I saw it, but I told myself it was just nerves. Then he showed up. He gestured at Jed. And suddenly, everything made sense. The way you jumped when riders came to town. The way you'd stare at the horizon like it was calling you. You were waiting for him. Clara felt tears sliding down her cheeks. I tried not to. I tried to forget, to be the woman I was supposed to be. I thought I could make it work, be a good wife. You think I want a wife who's pretending? Thomas's voice cracked. You think I want to wake up every morning next to a woman who wishes I was someone else? That's not... Isn't it? He laughed bitterly. Tell me, Clara, tell me honestly, if he wasn't an outlaw, if he was just a rancher like me, who would you choose? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Clara opened her mouth, closed it, unable to voice the truth that would destroy this good man who had done nothing but try to save her. It was Jed who spoke, his voice strained but clear. Don't answer that. Don't do that to him or yourself. He managed to sit up, one hand pressed to his bandaged shoulder. Caldwell, you're a decent man, better than I'll ever be. You could give her everything, a home, children, respectability. All I can offer is a life on the run, always looking over our shoulders. Never safe. What kind of man would I be if I let her choose that? Thomas studied him for a long moment. You love her, more than my own life. Jed admitted. That's why I'm leaving. Soon as this storm passes and I can ride. No, Clara said sharply. You're hurt, and Brewster's my problem, not yours. Jed looked at Thomas. Take your wife home. Caldwell, forget this happened. I'll disappear, and you'll never hear from me again. And Clara? Thomas asked quietly. What about what she wants? Both men turned to look at her. Clara stood there between them, her husband and the man who owned her heart. Duty and desire, safety and passion. The choice that was no choice at all. Thunder rumbled in the distance. The storm's last gasps. Soon it would pass completely, and with it, this moment suspended outside of time. Soon she would have to choose not just between two men, but between two versions of herself. She stopped, took a breath, started again. All my life, I've done what was expected. Been the dutiful daughter, the one who never complained, never asked for more. When my father got sick, I took care of him. When we needed money, I agreed to marry well, and I would have gone on that way, would have been content enough. Except, she looked at Jed, let him see everything in her eyes. Except for one night 3 years ago when I glimpsed what it felt like to be truly alive, to talk to someone who saw me, not just what I was supposed to be, and now I can't unknow that feeling, can't unfeel it, no matter how hard I try. Clara, Thomas started, but I also know what's right. She continued, turning to face him. You're a good man, Thomas, the best. You deserve a wife who loves you completely, not one who's always wondering what might have been. That's why. The door burst open. Brewster stood there, gun drawn, face twisted with rage. Empty, he snarled. The mine was empty. You lying witch. Everything happened at once. Brewster's gun swung toward Clara. Thomas dove for his rifle. Jed, despite his wound, rolled off the cot, reaching for his pistol. The gunshot was deafening in the small space. For a moment, Clara couldn't tell who had fired. Then she saw Brewster stagger, his gun dropping from nerveless fingers. Behind him, Sheriff Wallace lowered his smoking weapon. That's enough, Brewster, the sheriff said calmly. You're under arrest for attempted murder, threatening citizens, and generally being a pain in my jurisdiction. Brewster fell to his knees, clutching his shoulder where Wallace's bullet had found its mark. Behind the sheriff, several deputies appeared, guns drawn. Mrs. Caldwell. Wallace tipped his hat to Clara. Mr. Caldwell, got word you might be having some trouble up here. Mrs. Henderson saw you heading this way and thought you might need assistance. Sheriff, Thomas said slowly. Morrison. Wallace's eyes found Jed. Took in the bandage. The blood. I don't see any Morrison here. Just folks sheltering from the storm. Though I did hear tell that Black Jack Morrison was seen crossing into Canada this morning. Multiple witnesses. Shame we missed him. Jed stared at the sheriff. Why? Because sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing, Wallace said simply. And because 30 years ago, a young drifter pulled my boy out of a river when he'd have drowned otherwise. Never got to thank him properly before he moved on. He smiled slightly. You favor him some. Must be a coincidence. He turned to his deputies. Get Brewster and what's left of his gang back to town. They've got some questions to answer about their methods. As they dragged Brewster out, still cursing, Wallace paused in the doorway. Storm's passing. Roads should be clear by evening. Good day for traveling, if someone was inclined to travel. He touched his hat again and was gone. The three of them stood in the sudden silence, the implications of Wallace's words settling over them like dust after wind. He's giving you a chance. Thomas said to Jed, A head start. Seems so. Jed tested his shoulder, winced. I can ride. Where will you go? Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. North, Canada. Maybe somewhere they don't know Black Jack Morrison. He looked at her, and she saw the question he wouldn't ask, the invitation he wouldn't extend. Thomas saw it too. He walked to the door, stared out at the breaking clouds. I'll be at the wagon, he said quietly. Whatever you decide, Clara, just be sure. When he was gone, Clara and Jed faced each other across the small space that felt vast as an ocean. Come with me, he said simply. I know I have no right to ask, know what I'd be taking you from, but I'm asking anyway. Come with me. Jed, I can't promise you safety or comfort. Can't promise you anything but a life on the move, always wondering if someone will recognize us. But I can promise you'll never have to pretend again, never have to be less than what you are. Clara felt her heart tearing in two. Outside, she could hear Thomas hitching the horses, giving her time, giving her space to choose. The good man who would provide her with everything society said she should want. Inside, Jed waited, offering nothing but himself and a dangerous freedom. If I go with you, she said slowly, I break every vow I made, disappoint everyone who ever believed in me. My mother would be taken care of. Jed said firmly, I've got money saved, enough to pay your debts and more. She'd never want for anything, except her daughter. Except that, he agreed sadly. I won't lie to you. Clara, choosing me means giving up everything else. I hope I'm worth it. Thunder rumbled one last time, distant now, moving away across the mountains. The storm was truly passing, and with it, this strange moment when anything seemed possible. Clara closed her eyes, felt the weight of choice pressing down on her like the whole sky. When she opened them again, she knew what she had to do, what her heart had always known. I need to talk to Thomas, she said quietly. He deserves that much. Jed nodded, understanding flickering in his eyes, hope and fear and love all mixed together. I'll wait, however long it takes. I'll wait. Clara moved to the door, then paused. Looking back, no matter what happens, I want you to know, that night 3 years ago was the first time I ever felt truly alive. You gave me that. Even if nothing else comes of it, you gave me that. Then she stepped outside to face either heartbreak or freedom, knowing that either way, nothing would ever be the same again. Thomas stood by the wagon, his hands resting on the sideboard, gazing out at the valley below. The storm had washed the world clean, leaving everything sharp and bright in its wake. When Clara approached, he didn't turn, but she saw his shoulders tense. You've made your choice, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Clara stopped a few feet away, wrapping her arms around herself. Thomas, don't. He finally turned to face her, and the resignation in his eyes was worse than anger would have been. "Don't apologize. Don't try to explain. Just tell me, are you going with him?" The word stuck in her throat, but she forced it out. "Yes." Thomas nodded slowly, as if he'd expected it. "I suppose I knew yesterday, when you said your vows, you spoke them like you were reading from a book, not making promises from your heart. You're a good man, so everyone keeps telling me." A bitter smile touched his lips. "The good man who wasn't good enough. That's not true. You're everything a woman should want, kind, steady, generous, but not him." Thomas looked back at the valley. "I've been thinking, standing here, about the first time I saw you. You were 17, helping your father bring in the harvest. There was straw in your hair and dirt on your face, and you were laughing at something. I thought I'd never seen anything so beautiful." Clara felt tears burning her eyes. "Thomas, I waited 2 years to court you properly. Waited through your father's illness, through the mourning time. I thought I was being patient, respectful, but maybe I was just being a fool, thinking time would be enough. You weren't a fool. You were wonderful. Are wonderful. Some other woman will get a man whose wife left him for an outlaw the day after their wedding." Thomas laughed harshly. "That'll be the talk of the territory for years." Clara flinched. She hadn't thought about what this would mean for Thomas's reputation, his standing in the community. "We could say I died." "The storm, an accident, and have you live a lie from the very start?" He shook his head. "No, Clara, if you're going to do this, do it honest. You owe me that much." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of ending pressing down on them both. Finally, Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. "Here," he said, pressing it into her hands. "It's not much, but it'll get you started." Clara stared at the money. "I can't take this." "Yes, you can. Call it a parting gift, or payment for a lesson learned." He managed a real smile then, small and sad. "You taught me something. Clara, that loving someone isn't enough if they're dreaming of being somewhere else. I never meant—" "I know." He touched her face gently. "One last time. Be happy, Clara. Be free. And when you're racing across some distant plain with the wind in your hair, maybe think kindly of the fool who loved you." Clara threw her arms around him, hugging him fiercely. "You're not a fool. You're the best man I know." He held her for a moment, then gently set her aside. "Go on, before I change my mind and lock you in the root cellar until you come to your senses." Clara started toward the shack, then turned back. "What will you tell people?" "The truth, that my wife chose another path. Let them make of it what they will." He climbed up onto the wagon seat. "I'll send word to your mother that you're safe. The rest is up to you." As he drove away, Clara stood watching until the wagon disappeared over the rise. Then she wiped her tears and went back inside. Jed was on his feet, testing his shoulder. When he saw her face, he went very still. "You're staying with him?" "No." She moved to him, put her hands on his chest. "I'm going with you, if you'll still have me." The joy that blazed across his face was answer enough. He pulled her against him with his good arm, burying his face in her hair. "Are you sure? Once we leave, I'm sure." She pulled back to look at him. "But we need to go back to town first." His expression turned wary. "Clara, I need to see my mother, to explain, and to visit the church." "The church?" She took a deep breath. "I need to confess to Reverend Mills, not for absolution. I know what I'm choosing, but he deserves to hear it from me." Jed studied her face. "That's dangerous. The whole town will know within hours." "They'll know anyway. Thomas won't lie for me." She touched his face. "I won't start our life together by sneaking away like a thief. If I'm going to do this, I'll do it with my head high. Even if they stone you in the street? Even then." He smiled, that rare, real smile that transformed his hard features. "All right, but we go carefully. And if there's any sign of trouble, we run like the wind." Clara finished. "I know." They prepared quickly. Jed saddled his horse while Clara tried to make herself presentable, though her wedding dress was beyond salvation. When they were ready, she climbed up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist, careful of his wounded shoulder. The ride back to Willow Creek was like something out of a dream. The sun had broken through completely now, turning the wet prairie grass to gold. Every breath felt new, every heartbeat a choice renewed. They entered town by the back streets, but it didn't matter. Word spread like wildfire. Clara could see curtains twitching, faces appearing in windows. By the time they reached her mother's house, a small crowd had gathered. Margaret Whitfield stood on the porch, one hand clutched to her chest. When she saw Clara, her face went through a series of expressions: relief, confusion, understanding, sorrow. "Child," she said softly as Clara slid down from the horse. "Mama." Clara went to her, taking those worn hands in hers. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "Are you hurt? Did he—" Margaret's eyes went to Jed, still mounted, watching the growing crowd warily. "No, Thomas was everything he should be. This is my choice, Mama, my doing." Margaret searched her daughter's face. "You love this man, the outlaw, with everything I am. And he loves you." "Yes, ma'am." Jed spoke up. "More than my life." Margaret studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "I suppose I knew. A mother always knows when her child's heart is elsewhere." She squeezed Clara's hands. "You'll write when you can? When it's safe. That's all I ask." Margaret pulled her into a fierce hug. "Be careful. My brave, foolish girl. Be happy. Mrs. Henderson's right." Someone called from the crowd. "Shameless is what it is. Running off with a killer. Poor Thomas Caldwell." The voices grew uglier, the crowd pressing closer. Clara felt Jed tense, saw his hand move toward his gun. "That's enough." The voice rang out with authority. Reverend Mills pushed through the crowd, his face stern. "Get back, all of you. This is not a spectacle for your entertainment." "Reverend, I know what she's doing." He looked at Clara. "Child, are you certain? I need to speak with you. Reverend, privately." He nodded. "Come to the church, both of you." They made their way through the hostile crowd, the Reverend's presence keeping the worst at bay. Inside the church, in the same space where just yesterday vows had been spoken, Clara knelt before the altar. "Forgive me, Reverend," she said quietly. "I've broken sacred vows, disappointed good people, hurt a man who did nothing but love me." Reverend Mills sat in the front pew, his weathered face compassionate. "And yet you're leaving anyway?" "Yes." "Why?" Clara looked up at him. "Because staying would be the real sin. Spending my life pretending, giving Thomas half a heart when he deserves a whole one. That seems more cruel than leaving." "And this man," the Reverend glanced at Jed, who stood guard by the door. "Can he give you what you need?" "He gives me myself," Clara said simply. "With him, I don't have to be less than I am." The Reverend was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood, placing a hand on her head. "I cannot condone what you're doing. Clara, the church's position is clear, but I knew your father, watched you grow up. You've always had a spirit too big for this town." He sighed. "Go with God. Child, may he watch over you both." "Thank you," Clara whispered. As they prepared to leave, Sheriff Wallace appeared in the church doorway. "Time to go," he said quietly. "Some of Brewster's boys are stirring up trouble, talking about justice. I'll hold them off, but you need to leave now." Jed helped Clara mount behind him. As they turned to go, she looked back one last time at the church, the town, the life she was leaving behind. "No regrets?" Jed asked softly. "No regrets," she confirmed, tightening her arms around him. They rode out of Willow Creek at a gallop, pursued by shouts and curses, but nothing more. Sheriff Wallace had done his job well. As the town fell away behind them, Clara felt something lift from her shoulders, the weight of expectations, of being what others needed her to be. "Where to?" Jed asked as they slowed to rest the horse. "North," Clara said, "To Canada, to anywhere, as long as it's with you." He reached back to squeeze her hand. "It won't be easy. Life on the run." "I know what I'm choosing," she interrupted. "A life of uncertainty with you over a life of safety without you. That's no choice at all." They rode on through the afternoon, the sun warm on their faces, the world spread out before them like a promise. Behind them, Willow Creek buzzed with scandal. The story would be told and retold. How Clara Whitfield left her marriage bed to run away with an outlaw. How the preacher's blessing couldn't hold against the wildness in her heart. Some would call her wicked. Some would call her brave. Clara didn't care what they called her, as long as she was free. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, they made camp by a stream. Jed's shoulder needed tending, and they both needed rest before the long journey ahead. "Tell me about Canada," Clara said as she rebandaged his wound. "Cold winters," he warned. "Hard work. We'll need new names, new stories." "I don't care." She finished with the bandage and sat back on her heels. "We'll make our own story." He pulled her close with his good arm. "Clara Caldwell." "Not anymore," she corrected. "That woman stayed in Willow Creek. I'm just Clara now. Clara who belongs to no one but herself. And to me," he asked softly. "And to you," she agreed. "By choice, not by law, by love, not by duty." As darkness fell and the stars emerged, Clara thought of Thomas, probably home by now, facing an empty house. She thought of her mother, defending her daughter's choice to neighbors who would never understand. She thought of Reverend Mills, wrestling with the gap between doctrine and compassion. She grieved for the pain she'd caused, but not for the choice she'd made. Sometimes, she realized, being true to yourself required breaking faith with everyone else. "No regrets?" Jed asked again, echoing his earlier question. Clara looked up at the vast sky, felt the endless possibility of the frontier stretching out before them. "No regrets," she said firmly. "Only tomorrow." And tomorrow was enough. Spring came to Willow Creek like a gentle promise after the harsh winter. The prairie burst into bloom with purple lupines and golden buttercups, painting the landscape in colors that seemed almost too bright after months of white and gray. Clara stood in the garden behind Thomas's ranch house, her hands deep in the rich soil, planting seeds for the summer vegetables. 6 months had passed since that storm-torn wedding day. 6 months since she'd ridden out of town with Jed Morrison, only to return 3 days later, alone. Mrs. Caldwell, young Sarah, the hired girl, called from the porch. "You have a visitor." Clara straightened, brushing dirt from her apron. These days, visitors were rare. The scandal of her brief flight and unexpected return had made her something of a pariah in town, though Thomas's steadfast protection had prevented complete ostracism. Her mother stood in the parlor, looking frailer than when Clara had last seen her, but with the same sharp eyes. They embraced carefully, both aware of the delicate ground between them. "You look well," Margaret said, settling into a chair. "As do you, Mama. How are things in town?" "Oh, Mrs. Henderson still gossips. Sheriff Wallace still keeps the peace. Reverend Mills still preaches forgiveness while his congregation practices judgment." Margaret's smile held a touch of her old spirit. "They're starting to find new scandals to occupy themselves. The banker's daughter ran off with a traveling salesman last month." Clara poured tea, grateful for the familiar ritual. "And you? Are they treating you kindly?" "Well enough. Your husband sees to that." Thomas, always Thomas, quietly ensuring her mother had what she needed, never mentioning the debt his kindness created. "He's a good man," Clara said softly. "The best," Margaret agreed. "Which is why I need to ask, are you happy, child?" Clara set down her teacup carefully. "I'm content. That's not what I asked." Through the window, Clara could see Thomas in the distant field, working alongside his men. He'd been nothing but kind since her return, asking no questions, making no demands. They slept in separate rooms, lived parallel lives under the same roof, bound by law but little else. "I'm where I chose to be," Clara said finally. Margaret leaned forward, Clara, what happened? You left with such certainty, such fire in your eyes. Then 3 days later, Thomas brings you home, and you've been like a ghost ever since. Clara closed her eyes, remembering the abandoned cabin where they'd stopped that first night. Jed's fever rising as infection set in from his wound. Her desperate ride to find help, only to discover Brewster's men watching the roads. The terrible choice between Jed's life and their freedom. He was dying, she said simply. The wound went bad. He needed a doctor, medicine, safety to heal, things I couldn't give him on the run. So you came back. I traded my freedom for his life. Thomas agreed to help, to get him to a doctor, to give him safe passage north. If I came home. Clara's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. It was the only bargain that would save him. And Thomas kept his word. Of course he did. He's Thomas. A bitter smile touched Clara's lips. Jed's in Canada now, free, alive. The sheriff got word last month. Margaret reached across to take her daughter's hand. Do you regret it? How can I regret saving his life? Clara squeezed her mother's fingers. But sometimes, in the dark of night, I dream I'm riding north with the wind in my hair, and I wake up feeling like I can't breathe. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of choices made and unmade heavy between them. There's something else, Margaret said finally. I didn't come just to visit. There's news. Clara tensed. What kind of news? A letter came to the general store, from Montana, addressed to the widow Whitfield's daughter. Margaret pulled an envelope from her bag. Mr. Murphy didn't know what to do with it, so he gave it to me. Clara's hands shook as she took the letter. She recognized the careful script, the way the letters slanted as if leaning into wind. Inside her chest, her heart began a wild galloping. I'll leave you to read it in private, Margaret said, standing. But Clara, be careful. The whole town is watching, waiting for you to prove them right about their worst assumptions. When her mother had gone, Clara stood holding the letter, afraid to open it, afraid not to. Finally, she broke the seal. Clara, it began. I pray this finds you well and safe. I write from a place where spring comes slow but sure, where the mountains touch the sky, where a man can build a new life if he's willing to work for it. I have land now, bought honest with money earned honest, a cabin that doesn't leak, a view that would make you weep for its beauty. But it's empty. Clara, empty as my heart has been since I left you. I know I have no right to ask anything of you. Know you made your choice to save my worthless life. But if there's any chance, any hope that you might choose differently now that I can offer you something more than running. She couldn't read the rest through her tears. Clara pressed the letter to her chest, feeling her carefully constructed contentment crumble like old mortar. The front door opened, and Thomas entered, earlier than usual. He stopped when he saw her face, saw the letter in her hands. Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a resignation that broke her heart all over again. He wrote to you. Thomas said it wasn't a question. Yes. Thomas hung his hat on the peg by the door, movements deliberate and careful. Is he well? He has land, a cabin, a new life. Good, that's good. Thomas moved to the window, looking out at the fields he'd worked so hard to build. You know, I've been thinking these past months about second chances, about how sometimes the kindest thing we can do is let go. Thomas, I filed for divorce. Clara. The words hung in the air like a revelation. Clara stared at him, speechless. Abandonment. He continued quietly. You left me on our wedding night, returned against your will. Any judge would grant it. Your reputation will suffer, but it's already damaged. Mine will survive. The wronged husband, generous enough to seek legal separation rather than force an unwilling wife to stay. Why? Clara whispered. He turned to face her then, and she saw not anger or bitterness, but a deep, gentle sadness. Because you're dying here. Clara, a little more each day. Because I deserve a wife who wants to be with me. Because you saved a man's life by sacrificing your own happiness. and maybe it's time someone saved yours. Clara went to him, took his hands in hers. You're the best man I know, but not the one you love. He smiled sadly. Go, Clara. Go to your mountains and your man with his cabin that doesn't leak. Live the life you chose before I complicated it with my conditions. The scandal will pass. They always do. He squeezed her hands, then let go. I'll tell people the truth, that I'm setting you free because it's the right thing to do. Some will understand, some won't, but that's my choice to make, just as leaving is yours. Clara felt as if the ground beneath her feet had suddenly shifted, revealing sky where she'd expected stone. When? The papers will be final next month. After that, you're free to go wherever your heart takes you. She threw her arms around him, hugging him fiercely. I don't deserve your kindness. None of us deserve the grace we're given, he said softly. We just try to be worthy of it. That evening, as the sun set over the prairie, Clara walked to the top of the hill behind the ranch. From here, she could see for miles, the town in one direction, the endless horizon in the other. She thought about the girl she'd been 6 months ago, willing to risk everything for love, about the woman she'd become, tempered by sacrifice and loss. In her pocket, Jed's letter seemed to pulse with possibility. A cabin in Montana, mountains that touched the sky. A chance to choose again, this time without the wild desperation of that storm-torn night, but with the calm certainty of a decision made in full daylight. She thought about her mother. Who would understand? About Thomas, whose generosity humbled her. About Reverend Mills, who'd blessed her wedding but had seen the truth in her eyes. About Sheriff Wallace, who'd chosen justice over law. And she thought about Jed, waiting in his empty cabin, offering her not just passion now but partnership. Not just storm, but also shelter. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of spring flowers and distant rain. Clara spread her arms wide, feeling it catch her hair, her skirts, her spirit. For the first time in 6 months, she felt truly alive. She had been tested by storm and separation, by duty and desire. She had made choices that seemed right, choices that seemed wrong, choices that had torn her apart. But now, with spring blooming wild across the prairie and freedom beckoning from distant mountains, Clara Whitfield Caldwell knew exactly who she was and what she wanted. The preacher had blessed her wedding, binding her in law and obligation. The outlaw had claimed her passion in a storm, awakening a wildness she couldn't deny. But in the end, it was Clara herself who would choose her path, walking neither as wife nor as runaway, but as a woman complete unto herself, finally free to follow her heart home. She turned from the horizon and walked back to the house, already planning what little she would pack, what letters she would write, what words she would say. In a month, the papers would be final. In a month, she would point her horse north and ride toward mountains that touched the sky. And this time, she knew. There would be no turning back. The storm had passed, but its gifts remained. Passion discovered, strength tested, and love that endured separation and sacrifice. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Clara smiled, feeling the promise of tomorrow singing in her blood. Sometimes the greatest storms bring not destruction, but transformation. Sometimes they wash away not just what was, but what was never meant to be, leaving space for what should have been all along. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, they bring you home to yourself. Thank you for joining me on this wild journey through the American frontier. If you're listening to this story, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below and let's connect across the miles. Just like Clara's love transcended boundaries. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more tales of passion, courage, and the untamed spirit of the Old West. What did you think of Clara's choice? Would you have stayed or followed your heart? Share your thoughts below. I read every comment and love hearing your perspectives on these timeless stories of love and freedom.